What if the Muslims discovered Australia? If I was an alien visiting Earth during the Middle Ages and I had to guess who would colonize Australia, the English would probably be one of my last guesses. And this makes a lot of sense since England is practically on the other side of the Earth from Australia. But Australia has an Anglo culture related to that of Canada, Britain, and the United States. And the interesting thing is how Indonesia and New Guinea, Australia's closest neighbors, have had practically no effect upon its history. I'm actually surprised that the Muslims never did discover Australia in our timeline. The Muslim ships plied the waters in between Mozambique and Japan, and, sorry if I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Majapahit Sultanate of Java definitely knew about New Guinea and might have had colonies on the western coast of New Guinea, and New Guinea is only a stone's throw away from Australia. The discovery of 11th century East African Muslim coins in the north coast of Australia has led to the possibility that the Muslims in fact did discover Australia, but we don't know the actual date these coins were planted, so it's not complete evidence. I don't want to steal other people's ideas without giving them the proper due and respect, and I came up with the concept for this timeline from reading a blog called Surreal History, written by Matthew White, the author of Atrocities, and this timeline has the same point of departure as that timeline, but they're very different timelines, so if you've read that other timeline, you're going to be watching something different here. And if you're interested in the blog, which is admittedly very good, the link to it is in the description. This timeline would start in the 14th century when a Muslim vessel would wash up on the shores of northern Australia. It would return to Indonesia, and the authorities, seeing the potential, would send scouts and then settlers to the northern coast of the continent. By the way, for this timeline, when I say Muslim, keep in mind that I'm mainly referring to Indonesian Muslims. Today we have a misconception, and I'm very guilty of this too, that Middle Eastern/North African is synonymous with Muslim. But actually today, less than 20% of the world's Islamic population lives in North Africa and the Middle East. This is because 60% lives in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And the proximity of Java to Australia in this timeline means that the Muslim colonizers of Australia in this time would be overwhelmingly Indonesian. What's always puzzled me about Indonesian history is why there hasn't been more immigration from Java to the other islands. Java currently has more than half of Indonesia's population, and that percentage used to be higher before the other islands' interiors were exploited and farmed. Java is by far the smallest of the major Indonesian islands, and it can only sustain such a large population because the soil is much better than the rest of Indonesia. I've always wondered why the Javanese didn't immigrate out to the other Indonesian islands to leave the overcultivation of Java. And if any of you have the answer for this, can you please comment it in the description? This showed that Javanese civilization, and thus much of Indonesian civilization, has very little landlust. Thus, a colonization of the entirety of Australia would be impossible without the massive amounts of immigrants needed, and so Australia would likely remain a backwater in the Indonesian world and politics. Most likely, the Muslims would create coastal trading cities on the northern coast, similarly to how they did in East Africa, and trade with the aboriginals of the interior. Similarly to our timeline, Eurasian disease would kill a great percentage of the native population, yet if the Indonesians/Muslims posed no great threat to the local population's land, the population would be able to rebuild itself to pre-plague numbers. The recovered coastal Aboriginal population would blend with the Indonesian settlers and create a new North Australian culture. This would be similar to Swahili culture of our timeline, which is a mix of Arabic, Persian, and native African cultures. This would be opposed to the purely Aboriginal culture of the interior deserts. Technological exchange between the Muslims and the Aboriginals would not be complete. I don't mean to be offensive here, but the Aboriginals being hunter-gatherers would mean that they would be unable to replicate the Asian technologies. This would be similar to East Africa, where the Muslim technologies did not make deep inroads into sub-Saharan Africa. When the Portuguese would enter the Indian Ocean in the 16th century, the trade routes would immediately connect them with Australia. The Portuguese would then create trading depots in the coastal cities of northern Australia, similarly to India and Indonesia. In the 17th century, the Dutch, just like our timeline, would conquer the Portuguese Empire and thus secure the trade rights to northern Australia. Over time, like Indonesia with the Dutch or India with the British, these trade rights would turn into political dominance over the entire region. The Dutch lack of interests of settlement in East Asia and the sheer size of Australia would make the Dutch hold of Australia limited to the north coast. Meanwhile, North Australian colonies would simply be a backwater to the colony of Greater Indonesia. This would allow the British, wanting to find a place to put their convicts, would still choose Australia. The British would create convict colonies in the southeast of the continent, just like in our timeline. The native aboriginals, having adapted themselves to Eurasian diseases, would not die off in droves with the arrivals of the British. Thus there would be no empty regions created by the disease die-off that there was in our timeline, although the native population would still be hunter-gatherers, and thus they would not have the sheer numbers of population as farmer communities. The British, having settlement colonization in mind, would likely marginalize the hunter-gatherer communities in the deserts and outback while giving the settlers good land. In total, in our timeline, the colonization of Australia resulted in only around 30,000 casualties. For the entire conquest of a continent, that's not very much, disease not included. This would mean that a nastier outcome would be very likely. The general worthlessness of West Australia, besides mineral wealth around Perth, would mean that neither power would claim it for fear of an unnecessary political struggle with the other power. In the colonial race of the late 19th century, however, Europe was filled with colonial powers looking for land, not caring whether or not it was useless. The Germans in the late 19th century, wanting a colonial empire, would colonize West Australia for the mining wealth and to add an extra colony to the German Empire. The German colony of West Australia would be very similar to Namibia. Like Namibia, the Germans would have a small pocket of Germans for mining operations, while the majority of the population would remain Aboriginal. With the outbreak of World War I, the British would seize German West Australia and would become part of the British Empire. In World War II, with the Germans having conquered the Netherlands, and with the British Empire reeling from the loss of Singapore, North Australia would be defenseless against a Japanese conquest. The Japanese, wanting to knock out Australia so the troops could be moved to another front, would invade the British colony of Australia. Perth would be seized easily, and the Japanese would make assaults on the east coast of Australia. The Americans, wanting to protect its cultural relative of Australia, would rush an army to Australia in 1942 to protect it from Japanese conquest, and fighting would commence in New South Wales. The Americans have a massive advantage over the Japanese in the open terrain of the Australian outback. This is because the Japanese military was mainly an army of the infantry. If you look at the production statistics, almost all of Japan's army production was sent towards the infantry, while the US had a more varied army, which also used tanks and other forms for their army, and so they'd be able to dominate in the faster-paced and more open terrain of the outback. This would slow down the Pacific front quite a bit. The Americans, having to spend many months of the war fighting in Australia, would mean that Guadalcanal and the Central Pacific Campaign would have happened much later. This would give more time for the Russians to conquer more of Asia. The communist regime, for example, would control all of Korea. The later invasion of Japan would give time for the Russians to get involved, and Japan would be split in half between a communist north and a capitalist south. With the independence of Indonesia, the nationalistic government in Jakarta would want to bring the Dutch colony of North Australia into its fold. This happened in New Guinea in our timeline, which the Dutch originally wanted to keep and populate all the Dutch and colonial supporters from Indonesia and create a counter-Dutch Indonesia with. Yet the Indonesian government threatened Holland with war, and the Dutch bended. Yet having 700 years of cultural differences would mean that the North Australians would think of themselves as North Australians instead of as Indonesians. Thus, North Australia would become a bastion of separatist movements. These would be either Islamist or communist, depending on the policies of the Jakarta government. The Aboriginals might rebel as an ethnic rebellion as well. Meanwhile, South Australia would be similar to our timeline's Australia, except that the Aboriginals would be a majority in the western part of the country. What if Altish? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. And stay tuned for my next alternate history, What if Alexander the Great's empire never fell?